Most people like the idea of living off dividends. The thought of owning shares in solid companies and getting paid regularly without having to clock in at a job feels like the ultimate definition of freedom. But the truth is, very few people actually reach the point where dividends alone can cover their lifestyle. The numbers behind it are surprising, and when you look closely, it explains a lot about why wealth seems so out of reach for the majority. Dividends are simple on the surface. You own stock in a company, and if that company makes a profit and chooses to share some of it, you get paid. Usually it's quarterly, sometimes monthly, but the flow is consistent. For investors, it feels like cash flow that requires no extra work. But the real question is, how many people truly live on this? And what does it take to get there? The short answer is not many. According to most research, only a small percentage of retirees in developed countries rely primarily on dividends to cover their living expenses. In the United States, for example, fewer than 10% of retirees are able to live entirely off investment income, and dividends make up only a slice of that. Most retirees still rely heavily on pensions, Social Security, or part-time work. That fact alone shows how rare it is to reach the stage where dividends are enough. Why so few? The math is straightforward. A dividend yield on average sits around 2 to 4% per year for most large, stable companies. Some pay more, but often those higher yields come with higher risks. So let's say you want $40,000 a year from dividends. At a 4% yield, you'd need about $1 million invested. At 3%, you'd need closer to $1.3 million. And if you wanted a higher income, like $80,000 a year, you'd need double that. The reality is, very few households ever reach those levels of investable assets. This is where the shock comes in. People imagine that dividend investing is something many are doing, when in fact the number who actually achieve it is small. Globally, the percentage of individuals who live off dividends alone is tiny, often well under 5%. It's not because dividends don't work. It's because most people never accumulate enough capital to make them a meaningful source of income. The middle class often saves in ways that keep them from reaching this level. Money sits in checking accounts, low-yield savings, or retirement funds they don't actively manage. By the time retirement comes, the balance is often enough to provide some support, but not enough to live entirely off dividend income. That's why most people never see dividends as more than a nice extra, rather than a full financial foundation. But the flip side is that it's not impossible. In fact, there are many real examples of people who have built their lives around dividend income. And they didn't all start rich. What separates them is early planning, consistent investing, and a focus on building assets that generate cash flow rather than just chasing higher salaries. They treated dividends as a long game. For instance, someone who invests steadily in dividend-paying index funds over 20-30 years can accumulate a portfolio large enough to generate meaningful income. Even modest monthly investments, if compounded long enough, can result in hundreds of thousands in assets. This is how many in the financial independence community reach a point where dividends, combined with other forms of passive income, can actually replace their paycheck. Still, it's worth being realistic. Most people underestimate how much capital it takes. The image of someone retiring early and living comfortably on dividends often skips the fact that they saved aggressively for years. They lived below their means, reinvested their dividends instead of spending them, and allowed compounding to do its work. The end result looks effortless, but the buildup required a level of consistency most people never practice. There's also a psychological trap. Many people think of dividends like free money, forgetting that they're simply a return on capital already invested. If you don't have the capital, you won't see much income. A $10,000 investment might give you $300, $400 a year in dividends, depending on the yield. That's useful, but it's nowhere near life-changing. To get to the point of living fully off dividends, you need scale. And scale requires both time and discipline. This is why the number of people living entirely off dividends is so small. The average investor either doesn't save enough, starts too late, or spends too much of their income before. There's also a psychological trap. Meanwhile, those who do achieve it look unusual, almost rare, because they treated wealth building differently from the start. They didn't rely on raises or promotions alone. They built portfolios deliberately to eventually replace their paycheck. Another important point is diversification. Most people who live off dividends don't rely solely on them. They often combine dividend income with other sources, rental income, side businesses, royalties, or even part-time consulting. This mix gives stability because dividends alone can fluctuate. Companies sometimes cut or suspend payouts during tough times, and if you depend on them 100%, that creates risk. So even within this lifestyle, safety usually comes from having multiple streams. But here's where the opportunity lies. While very few live completely off dividends, Many more could if they adjusted their approach earlier. The formula is not complicated. Spend less than you earn, invest consistently in dividend-paying assets, reinvest the payouts, and let compounding take over. Over decades, the results stack up. The problem is, most people never stay consistent long enough. They dip in and out, chase quick wins, or increase spending instead of investing. That's why the statistic is so surprising. When you hear how few live off dividends, it's not because the system doesn't work. It's because people don't give it enough time or capital to work. Wealth through dividends is boring, slow, and predictable, and most people prefer the excitement of faster wins. But the ones who stick with boring and slow are the ones who eventually step out of the middle-class cycle and into financial independence. The deeper lesson is this: dividends are not a get-rich-quick method. They are a get-rich-slow method. And because of that, the number of people who commit to the process all the way through is incredibly small. But that's also what makes it powerful. If you're willing to treat it like a discipline rather than a fantasy, you separate yourself from the vast majority who never make it. It also reframes the idea of wealth. For the middle class, wealth is often measured in possessions, houses, cars, or lifestyle upgrades. For those who aim to live off dividends, wealth is measured in cash flow, how much their assets generate without them having to trade time. That's a subtle but massive difference, and it explains why only a small fraction ever cross that line. At the end of the day, the number of people living off dividends is shocking because it shows how rare real financial independence is. The vast majority are still tied to wages, still tied to active work, and still tied to one main income stream. Dividends represent the opposite, a system where money works for you quietly in the background. But to reach that point, you need to commit early, stay consistent, and think in decades rather than months. The system itself isn't broken. Dividends have worked for more than a century, and they continue to create steady wealth for those who commit. The problem is that most people never get far enough to see the results. They give up when the numbers look small. They collect a $50 or $100 dividend check and think it isn't worth the effort. But those same small checks, reinvested consistently, are the foundation of the big checks that come later. The process looks invisible for years until one day it suddenly becomes obvious. It's also important to recognize that dividends aren't just about retirement. For many, they become a tool to create options earlier in life. The real shock isn't just how few people live entirely off dividends, but how few even try to build toward it. Most households never plan beyond their paycheck. They assume retirement will somehow take care of itself, or they rely completely on government programs. Dividends represent the opposite, a personal system of independence, built piece by piece that doesn't depend on outside support. And yet, because the results are slow, most people never take it seriously enough to see what it can become. That's why the lesson here is more than numbers. It's about mindset. Dividends force you to think long-term. They teach patience, discipline, and delayed gratification. They reward those who stick with boring consistency while others chase short-term excitement. And because so few adopt that mindset, the number of people who actually live off dividends will likely always remain small.